This is public land. I'm seizing it all." That was the scream I woke up to, followed by the sound of metal clashing against my "no trespassing" sign. Imagine standing on the porch of the cabin your grandfather built with his bare hands, only to watch a self-crowned HOA queen storm your gate with cops at her heels, cameras rolling, and neighbors gawking like it was some twisted reality show. My heart should have raced with fear, but instead, I felt something else calm. Because while Karen thought she was about to bury me under fabricated rules and social media outrage, I carried something far more powerful than her lies. Hidden in my pocket was a piece of paper that could shatter her empire and reveal the truth about this entire neighborhood. What happened next would flip every assumption upside down. The first crack of her hammer against my "no trespassing" sign split the morning like thunder. I had been sipping coffee on the porch, staring at the mist rising off the pines, when the sound jolted through the stillness, the kind of sound that tells you peace is officially over. When I stepped out fully, mug still in hand, the sight was something I'll never forget. A woman in a blinding white blazer, the kind of garment no sane person would wear to the edge of the woods, was swinging a hammer like she was driving a stake through the heart of a monster. My sign, the one my late father had nailed to the fence decades ago, splintered under her blows. Behind her stood 2 police officers, their patrol cars idling with lights painting red and blue streaks across the trees. And just beyond them, a growing crowd of neighbors had gathered, phones raised, recording like they'd been promised front row seats to a circus. "This is public land," she screeched, every word echoing in the valley. "I'm seizing it all by order of the HOA. You have no right to be here." The arrogance in her voice was chilling. She wasn't asking, wasn't suggesting, wasn't even trying to negotiate. She was proclaiming, a queen crowning herself ruler of land that wasn't hers. The cops shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between her confidence and their own uncertainty. Most people in that moment would panic. They'd stammer, plead, maybe even break down. That's exactly what she expected. She wanted me to crumble, to look weak in front of those cameras so she could immortalize my defeat in one of her viral TikTok clips. But I didn't panic. I didn't plead. Instead, I set my coffee carefully on the railing, brushed the dust from my jeans, and walked down the porch steps with deliberate calm. The old boards creaked under my boots, the sound sharp in the hush between her outbursts. When I reached the gate, I didn't rush to defend myself. I didn't shout. I simply placed my hand on the rusted latch and pushed. The iron hinges screamed as the gate swung open, a noise that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. Her eyes widened for half a second, then narrowed into a smirk. She lifted her hammer again, pointing it at me like a judge passing sentence. "Don't let him tamper with the property line," she barked at the officers. "This man is trespassing. His cabin is illegal. Every inch of it violates our community standards." I let her rant. I even let the neighbors whisper to one another, some muttering that they'd long wondered how my cabin survived without HOA oversight, others gleeful at the prospect of seeing me dragged away. Then, when the noise reached its peak, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the folded papers I'd carried for months. My grandfather's deed, the original survey maps, the permits, documents older than most of the people in that crowd. I unfolded them slowly, deliberately, letting the crackle of ancient paper punctuate the silence. The sunlight caught the yellowed edges, the black ink still sharp where my grandfather's careful script marked out the boundaries. Lines that had never moved, no matter how many fences had been built or community improvements declared. "This land has been in my family since 1962, I said, my voice carrying over the heads of the gawkers. "This cabin was built by my grandfather with his own hands, long before any of you were paying HOA fees or planting ornamental shrubs, and these papers prove it. Every nail, every beam, every inch of soil here belongs to my family, not to you, not to the HOA, and not to anyone who thinks authority is the same as ownership." The crowd shifted. A ripple of doubt passed through them. One of the officers, Kent, the older one, held out a hand. "Sir, may I see those documents?" Her tone was measured, not hostile, the way of someone who'd seen too many of these disputes and knew not to trust appearances. The woman's, Karen's, expression flickered, just for a heartbeat. Panic broke through her painted mask. She snapped her head toward Kent, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "Of course, officer," she purred, her voice suddenly sweet, sugary, manufactured. She flipped her phone around, red recording light blinking, and addressed her invisible audience. "Don't worry, preservation warriors. Just a little paperwork shuffle, but we'll have this illegal structure dealt with soon enough." The cameras kept rolling. The neighbors kept recording. Thousands of strangers, somewhere out there, were watching live. To them, she was the heroine of the story, the defender of public space. She thought this was her victory lap. But I knew better. I watched her preen for her audience, gesturing at my cabin like it was a condemned shack. I saw the neighbors nodding, some enthralled, others skeptical. And I realized then what she didn't. This wasn't about aesthetics or heritage preservation. It wasn't about rules. It was about power. She wanted to own the narrative, to weaponize the HOA as her kingdom. But kingdoms crumble when the foundation is rotten. And I was holding the proof. I handed the deed to Detective Kent, watching her eyes narrow as she scanned the signatures. The county seals, the notations. Officer Martinez leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. Even from where I stood, I could see them recognizing the legitimacy of the papers. Karen's voice grew shriller, louder, as if she could drown out the truth with sheer volume. "These documents are irrelevant, outdated. Our Heritage Preservation Board has updated the guidelines, and this cabin is in direct violation of setback requirements, 3.2 feet into public green space." She spat the measurement like it was a death sentence. But Kent didn't look convinced. She tapped her pen against the margin of the deed, her voice steady. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify these claims with the county records office before taking any further action. Until then, this property remains under his possession." The crowd murmured again, this time with less certainty. A few people lowered their phones. Someone whispered, "Wait, there's no Heritage Preservation Board, is there?" Another shook his head, muttering, "Never heard of one." Karen's mask cracked further. Her hammer trembled slightly in her grip, though her smile never wavered for the camera. She wasn't just fighting me now, she was fighting the truth leaking through the cracks of her performance. I leaned on the fence, meeting her gaze with calm she couldn't shake. "You wanted a show," I said quietly enough that only she and the officers could hear. "But you've just given me the stage. And when the truth floods out, it won't be your story people remember." For a long second, the air was still. The pine trees stood tall and silent, the weight of history pressing down on the clearing. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this was only the opening act of a battle that had been brewing for decades. Because while she thought she was seizing land, what she was really doing was digging up secrets buried too long. And I was ready to open the floodgate. The day after that confrontation should have been calm. It should have been like every other morning I'd spent in the cabin for the past 3 years, coffee brewing, the smell of pine resin drifting in through the open windows, the sound of birds darting between the branches. This place had always been a sanctuary, a living reminder of my family's roots. But ever since Karen Caldwell, self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, got herself elected, peace had become a luxury. I often thought back to the cabin's beginnings. My grandfather built it in 1962, long before developers carved paved streets into the valley and filled it with copy-paste houses stacked side by side. He was a Korean War veteran, a man of quiet hands and stubborn pride. Every beam was cut by him, every nail hammered with care. He didn't just build a home, he built a legacy. My father grew up here, fishing in the creek that once cut across the meadow, playing baseball in the clearing that was now buried under someone else's driveway. When I was a boy, I'd visit the cabin with my dad, spending summers sanding the wooden porch or patching the tin roof. I never thought I'd end up living here full time. But when Dad passed, cancer eating away at him faster than doctors could stop, I made him a promise. I told him I'd keep the cabin standing, no matter what. He squeezed my hand, thin and frail in that hospital bed, and whispered, "Don't let them take it from you." At the time, I didn't understand who they were. Now, standing in the shadow of Karen's HOA reign, I knew exactly who he meant. The morning after she stormed my gate, I tried to keep busy, repairing a loose board on the deck. The scent of sawdust usually calmed me, gave me focus. But that morning, my chest felt heavy. The confrontation replayed in my head like a broken record. The hammer, the officers, the neighbors whispering, her smug grin as she spoke into that camera. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, she was building an audience, turning my life into her performance. The sound of heels clicking on gravel snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked up, and there she was again. Same blazer, same tablet clutched against her chest like it was holy scripture. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her trailed a thin man with a clipboard, eyes downcast, shuffling like he regretted every step. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she chirped, her voice coated in saccharine sweetness. "I'm conducting a compliance inspection. Your property has several serious violations." She raised the tablet, screen flashing in the sun, and began scrolling through photographs she'd clearly taken of my cabin. She narrated each violation like she was unveiling evidence at a trial. Non-period materials, encroachment on green space, structural hazards. I wiped my hands on my jeans and met her eyes. "This cabin predates your entire HOA. I've got the permits, the surveys, the deed. Everything is in order." Her smile froze, but her eyes went cold. "I'm afraid your old paperwork no longer applies. Mr. Miller, our Heritage Preservation Board has established new guidelines. Your cabin fails to meet them." I almost laughed. "There is no Heritage Preservation Board." I shot back. "I checked with the county myself. You're inventing rules out of thin air." That was when she made her next move. She flipped her tablet to selfie mode, the little red recording light glowing. Her voice changed instantly, dripping with that performative energy people use when pandering to strangers online. "Hello, preservation warriors," she cooed, panning the camera across my cabin. "Here we are at the illegal structure we've been discussing. The owner refuses to cooperate with our community improvement efforts." Neighbors began to appear again, drawn like moths to the drama. Some waved nervously into her camera. Others folded their arms, already convinced by her narrative. My stomach twisted. These were people I'd helped fixing broken fences, pulling their cars from ditches in snowstorms. And now, thanks to Karen's carefully edited performance, they saw me as the villain. Then my son, Ethan, stepped out onto the porch. 16 years old, wiry, his brown hair messy from sleep. He'd heard the noise. He pulled out his phone and started recording from a different angle. "Dad," he whispered, "she's live right now. TikTok. She's got like 50,000 viewers." It hit me then this wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was character assassination in real time, broadcast to an audience who didn't know me, didn't care about facts, only drama. Karen wasn't just after my land. She was after my reputation. She wanted to crush me publicly, to humiliate me until I gave up. I looked at Ethan, then at the cabin behind us, sunlight catching the careful joints my grandfather had cut into the beams. This wasn't just wood and nails, this was my family's blood. And I realized, with a chill running through me, that Karen was playing a much larger game than anyone realized. She wasn't satisfied with being HOA president. She wanted power, attention, control, and she would bulldoze anyone who stood in her way. What I didn't know then was that this spectacle, the cameras, the fake board, the live stream was only her opening move, and that an old man down the street carried a secret that would rip her entire empire apart. By the end of that week, I realized Karen wasn't just testing the limits of HOA authority, she was perfecting a performance. What started as her shouting at my fence turned into a full-fledged online campaign, complete with hashtags, daily live streams, and edited video clips that painted me as the enemy of community values. If she'd been a small-town busybody before, now she was a self-styled influencer, feeding an audience that thrived on outrage. Every morning, she strutted into the neighborhood in heels, armed with her pink tablet, an upgraded microphone, and a smile polished for the camera. Preservation warriors, she'd announced to her viewers. Today, we're inspecting another property that threatens our heritage. Inevitably, she'd end up back at my cabin, her favorite target. The neighbors started treating her live streams like weather reports, logging in daily to see whose property was next on the chopping block. The part that cut the deepest was seeing familiar faces in the background of her videos. Neighbors I'd helped replace a roof for, folks I'd lent my tools to, even the couple I'd pulled out of a ditch one icy winter night. They weren't standing with me. They were nodding along to Karen's script, clapping at her every accusation, as if she were performing for them instead of against me. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that truth would outlast gossip, that documentation would silence drama. But ignoring Karen was like ignoring a fire. She didn't burn out, she spread. By the third live stream, her TikTok following had doubled. By the fifth, she was fielding donations through cash apps from people across the country who believed they were funding some noble crusade to defend public land. Ethan was the one who woke me up to the scale of it. One evening, he came into the cabin with his phone in hand, his face pale. "Dad, look at this," he said, thrusting the screen toward me. Karen's page glowed bright, a new video already at 40,000 views. In it, she walked past my cabin with a dramatic sigh. "Here we are again," she narrated. The illegal cabin, the dangerous eyesore, the selfish homeowner who refuses to respect the rules we all agreed to live by. The camera zoomed in on my porch, where my work boots sat by the door. She framed them like evidence of some crime. Her caption read, "Every day he defies us. How long can one man hold an entire community hostage, Dad?" Ethan whispered. "People are commenting stuff like, 'Burn it down and kick him out already. They don't even live here. They don't know you.'" The words hit like a gut punch. It was no longer just Karen versus me. She had weaponized strangers, people thousands of miles away, who saw me not as a father, a neighbor, or a man preserving his family's history, but as a villain in her scripted drama. I clenched my fists. "This isn't about violations," I said. "It's about her building an empire. If she destroys me, she proves she can destroy anyone." Ethan hesitated, then met my eyes. "Then we fight back the way she fights. Dad, with proof, with cameras, with the truth." It was a strange moment, my son, barely 16. Showing a kind of clarity adults often lack. He pulled out a small tripod from his backpack, something he'd bought with saved allowance money, and set it up on the porch. "If she wants to make a show," he said, "we'll give her the other side of it." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's old documents spread out in front of me. Deeds, surveys, permits, yellowed letters from county officials. I thought about what Karen had said earlier, about the so-called Heritage Preservation Board. I had called the county myself and confirmed it didn't exist. She was inventing institutions out of thin air, draping them in authority. And people believed her because she said it with confidence. Confidence. That was her weapon. Not law, not truth, just performance. The next morning, when she came strutting down the gravel with her clipboard man in tow, I was ready. Ethan had the camera rolling from the porch while I waited at the gate, documents tucked neatly in a folder under my arm. "Mr. Miller," she greeted, sugary venom dripping from every syllable. "I'm afraid your non-compliance has escalated. This will be your final notice before I file for forced removal." "Funny," I said, holding up the folder, "because I called the county yesterday. They've never heard of your heritage board. They also said trespassing on private property with the intent to harass can land you in court. For the first time." She faltered, just a twitch at the corner of her mouth. But I caught it. Her phone was already recording, her followers already piling into the live chat. She raised her voice to the camera, cutting me out of frame. "See? Warriors. He's belligerent. He's threatening. Exactly the kind of individual who makes communities unsafe." I took a step closer, not for her, but for the camera. My voice stayed even. "Unsafe." I held up the deed, the official county seal glinting in the sun. "This is 60 years of proof. Unsafe is rewriting history to steal land that isn't yours." The comments on her screen flew faster. Ethan zoomed in on my papers, showing every viewer that my claims weren't just words, they were backed by ink. Seals, signatures. Karen's smile faltered again. She snapped the tablet shut, but it was too late. The tide had shifted. For every one of her preservation warriors spamming insults, there were 3 viewers asking why she hadn't shown her supposed board or filed actual paperwork. That evening, Ethan scrolled through her past posts and made a chilling discovery. "Dad," he said, "it's not just us. She's done this to 12 other families. Always the same pattern. Pictures, live streams, fake violations." He turned his phone so I could see. Each screenshot was a different house, a different family, a different caption calling them dangerous, illegal, or non-compliant. I exhaled slowly. She's not just targeting me. She's running a campaign. I didn't know it yet, but our little battle was about to unravel into something much bigger, because somewhere down the street, an old man named Earl Morrison had been keeping a secret for 40 years. And that secret was about to turn Karen's empire of lies into a house of cards ready to collapse. The morning after Ethan uncovered Karen's long trail of victims, I thought things might finally quiet down. Maybe, I told myself, she'd realize people were beginning to question her authority, that the comments piling up beneath her live streams were no longer as adoring as before. But I should have known better. People like Karen don't back down when their power is challenged. They double down. I was on the porch again, patching up the same loose board that had started this whole mess in the first place, when I saw a figure making his way down the dirt road. It wasn't Karen this time. It was Earl Morrison, my neighbor from 3 lots down. Earl was 70 if he was a day, with a stiff back and the kind of slow, deliberate gait that comes from a lifetime of work and the weight of secrets. He clutched a manila envelope against his chest like it was a lifeline. "Morning, Jason," he called, his voice carrying a tremor. "Mind if I come up?" Something in his tone made me set the hammer down. Earl wasn't the type to socialize much. He tended his garden, waved politely, and kept to himself. For him to walk all the way here, clutching an envelope like it contained state secrets, meant something was badly wrong. By the time he reached the porch steps, he was breathing hard, sweat glistening on his temples despite the cool air. He sat heavily on the railing and placed the envelope on his lap. "I seen what's happening," he said, eyes darting toward the road as though Karen might materialize out of thin air. "And I can't stay quiet no more." Before I could respond, a familiar, grating voice cut through the air. "Mr. Morrison, how wonderful to see you out and about." "Karen, of course." She emerged from behind the corner, pink tablet in hand, streaming already. Her smile stretched unnaturally wide. "No need to trouble yourself with this private matter, Earl. We've got it handled." But Earl didn't even look at her. For the first time since I'd known him, his back straightened, his voice firm. "No, Tamara," he said, using her full name. "This ain't about compliance or rules. This is about the truth." The word truth landed like a hammer blow. Karen's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. "Mr. Morrison, let's not confuse these fine people with old stories. You have your own property to worry about. That's enough." He cut her off. And for a moment, I saw the man he must have been decades ago, sharp-eyed, unyielding. He pushed the envelope into my hands. "Jason, your grandfather trusted me with this. I should have spoken up 40 years ago, but I was scared. Too many people with power, too much money on the line. But after watching you stand your ground, I can't keep it locked away anymore." My palms tingled as I accepted the envelope. The paper inside felt heavy, older than me, older than most of the neighborhood. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Earl's eyes flicked to Karen, who was still live streaming, her smile stiffening into a mask of panic. "Proof," he said simply. "Proof this whole HOA was built on a lie." The crowd that had gathered, because by now, there was always a crowd, shifted uncomfortably. Neighbors glanced at one another, suddenly unsure whose story to believe. Karen adjusted her tablet, angling it so the lens caught only her best side. But I noticed her grip tightening. She was rattled. I pulled the flap open just enough to see the corner of an old survey map. The ink faded but still legible. My heart pounded. Earl leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only I and Ethan could hear. "Hayes, Jonathan Hayes, the developer. Your granddad knew he was crooked. He documented everything. That envelope holds the kind of evidence that can bring this whole rotten structure down." Karen must have sensed the shift in momentum, because she suddenly stepped between us and the officers who had just arrived in response to yet another one of her complaints. "Detective Kent, Officer Martinez, she said brightly. There's no need to listen to Mr. Morrison's ramblings. He's confused, elderly. None of this is relevant. But Earl wasn't backing down. He lifted his chin, voice steady despite the quiver in his hands. Confused, he barked. I was the county surveyor back in 1985. I watched Hayes alter maps. I watched families pressured off their land. And I kept quiet. Too damn long. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Even Detective Kent's posture shifted from weary patience to sharp attention. She extended her hand toward me. Mr. Miller, may I see that envelope? Karen lunged forward, her composure cracking. That's private. That has nothing to do with this case. Her voice, shrill and desperate, echoed off the cabin walls. For the first time since she started this campaign, she was losing control of the narrative. Ethan, recording the entire exchange from the porch, whispered, Dad, she's panicking. Look at her hands. And sure enough, Karen's perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she tried to shield her camera from capturing Earl's face. She didn't want his words preserved, didn't want her audience to hear the one thing she couldn't spin the truth. I handed the envelope to Detective Kent. She flipped it open carefully, pulling out brittle survey maps, faded deeds, and even cassette tapes labeled in my grandfather's neat handwriting. Her brow furrowed deeper with every page she scanned. Finally, she looked up, her eyes locking with Karen's. These documents suggest the property boundaries used to establish this HOA may have been falsified. That's a very serious allegation. Karen's live stream was still rolling, but her voice cracked when she tried to speak. This is absurd. Fabrications, conspiracy theories. But nobody was nodding along anymore. Even the neighbors who had cheered her on days earlier now shifted uneasily, whispering to one another. The spell she'd cast with her confidence and her camera was unraveling. Earl turned to me, his expression equal parts sorrow and relief. Jason, your grandfather wasn't just protecting this cabin. He was protecting the truth, and I won't let it die with me. I felt the weight of the envelope, the generations of silence it represented. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just my fight. This was bigger, much bigger. Karen had built her power on performance and lies, but performance collapses in the face of hard evidence. And thanks to Earl, I now held the one thing she couldn't live stream away. What none of us knew at that moment, though, was just how deep the rabbit hole went, because those fragile papers were only the beginning. The manila envelope Earl placed in Detective Kent's hands was enough to make the officers pause. But what he revealed to me later that evening made my knees go weak. After the crowd dispersed, after Karen stormed off in a fit of barely contained rage, her camera still rolling though her voice cracked with panic, Earl quietly pulled me aside. His eyes were heavy, not just with age, but with the burden of decades. Jason, he said softly, what I gave the detective today was only part of it. I've kept the rest hidden in my house, waiting for the day someone would need it. His voice trembled, but there was a fire there, too. The kind of fire that comes from deciding fear has run its course. You and your boy come by tonight. It's time you saw everything. That night, Ethan and I walked the gravel path to Earl's house. His porch light flickered weakly, illuminating a home that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and mothballs. The wallpaper peeled in places, and the furniture creaked under the weight of time. Earl motioned for us to sit on a couch that sagged under our weight, then disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he was carrying a battered shoebox, the kind you'd expect to hold dusty photographs or forgotten receipts. But when he set it down on the coffee table and lifted the lid, my breath caught. Inside were layers of documents, folded maps, and small cassette tapes sealed in plastic bags. At the very bottom was a USB drive wrapped in a Ziploc with my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting across the label insurance policy. In case something happens. Earl's hands shook as he began pulling out the contents. Back in 1985, I was the county surveyor. He began, voice rough with memory. Jonathan Hayes, the developer, approached me with what looked like standard maps. He wanted to turn this whole valley into a planned community. But the maps didn't match the original surveys. He was shifting property lines, shrinking some plots, expanding others. When I asked him why, He said it was to modernize the district. Then he offered me more money than I'd ever seen in my life to sign off without raising questions. Ethan leaned forward, eyes wide. "So you knew the maps were fake?" Earl nodded slowly. "I knew, and so did your grandfather. He figured it out even before I did." He started documenting everything: recordings of Hayes, copies of the altered surveys, even meetings with county officials who were clearly on the take. He knew Hayes wasn't just bending rules. He was orchestrating a fraud that would let him steal land and flip it into profits. He pushed one of the cassette tapes toward me. Across the label, in my grandfather's blocky handwriting, were the words Hayes Meeting Number 3, March 1985. My stomach churned as I imagined his voice on that tape, still fighting for truth decades after his death. But why didn't he go public, I asked, my voice breaking. Why hide it all in a box? Earl's eyes dimmed. Because Hayes threatened him, threatened his son, your father, and any future grandchildren. Said if your granddad went public, his family would pay the price. He had people in the courthouse, in the sheriff's department, even in the state commission. It wasn't just Hayes he'd be fighting. It was a whole network. Your granddad decided to bide his time, to keep the evidence safe until the day came when someone had the strength to use it. Ethan picked up the USB drive, holding it like a sacred relic. "And that day is now," he whispered. I nodded, throat tight. My grandfather hadn't just built a cabin. He had built a shield, one meant to protect us even long after he was gone. Earl smiled weakly, then pulled out a hand-drawn survey map. "Look here," he said, tracing the lines with his crooked finger. "According to the real boundaries, your land doesn't stop at the fence. It stretches another 100 feet right into where Karen's house sits now. She's been squatting on your family's land without even knowing it." The words hit me like a hammer. All this time, she'd accused me of trespassing, of building illegally, of stealing public land when in reality, she was the trespasser. The queen of the HOA was nothing more than a squatter on stolen ground. Ethan's eyes gleamed with a mix of horror and excitement. "Dad, if we can prove this, she's done. Not just here if she's been using Hayes's fake maps to harass other families. This could unravel everything she's built." Earl leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written into every line of his face. "I kept this hidden for 40 years because I was scared. But watching you stand up to her, watching your boy fight with truth instead of fear, it gave me courage. Your grandfather would want this brought into the light." We spent the next hour scanning through the papers, unfolding brittle maps, and labeling the tapes. Ethan connected the USB drive to his laptop, and suddenly, dozens of files flooded the screen: audio recordings, scanned documents, letters, even early attempts at digitizing the original surveys. My grandfather had been thorough, almost obsessive. He had known one day these files would be needed. One audio file in particular made my blood run cold. Hayes's voice, clear and cocky, discussing with a county supervisor how they could shift property boundaries without anyone noticing. By the time anyone realizes what happened, the community will be so valuable nobody will want to rock the boat. In the background of the recording, I could hear the faint rustle of papers and another voice. My grandfather's, quiet, steady, asking pointed questions, documenting everything. Ethan paused the playback, his hand trembling over the mouse. "Dad, this is bigger than Karen. This isn't just about one HOA president gone rogue. This is a conspiracy." I leaned back, staring at the cabin's legacy sprawled across Earl's table. Hayes had built a house of cards on fraud, bribery, and intimidation. Karen had resurrected that playbook, turning social media into her weapon. But now, thanks to my grandfather's foresight and Earl's courage, we had the ammunition to bring the whole rotten empire down. The truth wasn't just knocking at Karen's door. It was about to kick it off the hinges. The announcement for the emergency HOA community meeting arrived the following week, slipped into every mailbox on embossed paper that looked more like a wedding invitation than a notice of neighborhood business. "Mandatory attendance required," it declared in bold letters, as if Karen's word had the weight of law. I knew what it meant. Karen wasn't backing down, she was escalating. This was going to be her grand performance, the stage where she intended to crush me publicly once and for all. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the gymnasium of the elementary school at the edge of the neighborhood. By the time Ethan and I arrived, the parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined the street for blocks, and news vans with satellite dishes sprouted like mushrooms, their reporters already broadcasting live. Inside, the gymnasium buzzed with tension. Folding chairs had been set up in rows, every one of them filled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold glow on the polished wooden floor. At the front of the room stood Karen, flanked by two assistants in matching blazers. She had transformed the space into something between a courtroom and a theater, easels displaying enlarged property maps, a projector screen waiting for her presentation, even professional lighting rigs that made the whole thing look like a press conference. When she spotted me, her smile widened, but it wasn't warmth. It was the smile of a predator who thinks the trap is about to snap shut. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice magnified by a microphone, "thank you for coming tonight. We are here to address a grave threat to our community heritage. An illegal cabin, built without proper oversight, continues to violate our standards and endanger our property values." Her words dripped with venom, but her delivery was flawless. She clicked her tablet, and the projector flared to life. On the screen appeared drone footage of my cabin, complete with computer-generated overlays showing supposed violations. Lines were drawn across the screen, highlighting imaginary encroachments into public land. Dramatic music underscored her narration as though this were a documentary exposing a criminal empire rather than a family cabin built in the 1960s. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Some neighbors nodded along, convinced by the slick presentation. Others folded their arms, skeptical. But Karen pressed on, voice rising with practiced fervor. "This isn't just about one man," she declared. "This is about protecting what we've all built together. If we allow individuals to ignore the rules, we invite chaos. We must act now to preserve our community." Her assistants held up glossy charts and graphs, statistics no doubt plucked from thin air, each one designed to look official. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had convinced herself that performance and truth were the same thing. When her presentation finally ended, applause broke out in pockets of the crowd, though it was hesitant, uncertain. Karen stood tall, basking in what she thought was victory. Then Marcus Webb rose from the audience. Marcus was an old friend of mine, a former construction buddy turned property lawyer after a back injury ended his building career. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said evenly, "With your permission, I'd like to offer a counterpoint." The room went still. Karen's smile faltered, but she couldn't very well deny him without looking like a dictator. She gestured with strained politeness. "By all means, Mr. Webb." Marcus walked to the projector, carrying Ethan's laptop under one arm. He plugged it in, and within seconds the screen behind Karen transformed. Gone were her slick drone overlays. Instead, the screen displayed scanned documents, yellowed deeds, original survey maps, even county seals embossed on paper older than most of the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his tone calm but commanding. "What you are about to see is not speculation, not computer graphics. This is evidence that the very foundation of this HOA is fraudulent." He clicked to the next slide, a recording transcript displayed on the screen. Hayes's voice filled the room, captured decades earlier on one of my grandfather's tapes. "By the time anyone realizes what happened, the community will be so valuable nobody will want to rock the boat." The gymnasium erupted. People whispered, gasped. Some shouted. Karen's face drained of color. Marcus continued. "These documents show that property boundaries were altered illegally in 1985 by developer Jonathan Hayes. With the complicity of county officials, families were forced out, land was stolen, and this HOA was built on lies." Earl Morrison stepped slowly to the front, leaning on his cane. The crowd hushed. The old man's voice cracked, but carried weight, born of guilt and truth. "I was the county surveyor," he said. "I saw it happen. I stayed quiet because I was scared, but I won't stay quiet anymore. Your HOA exists because of fraud." A stunned silence followed. Then, slowly, the silence broke into murmurs, anger, disbelief, outrage. Neighbors who had once cheered for Karen now turned to one another, eyes wide, demanding answers. Karen snapped, her mask shattered. Lies she screamed into her microphone, her voice shrill. Conspiracy theories. Don't you see they're trying to destroy our community with baseless accusations? But the more she shouted, the less convincing she became. The calm authority she had built her empire on was gone, replaced by wild flailing. Detective Kent, seated near the back, stood up. Her voice cut through the chaos. Based on the evidence presented, the county will be opening a formal investigation. Until then, all HOA enforcement actions are suspended. The crowd exploded some cheering, others demanding Karen's resignation. Karen stood frozen, microphone still in hand, her live stream still blinking red. For the first time, her audience wasn't cheering. They were watching a queen lose her crown in real time. Ethan turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, we just turned the whole neighborhood upside down." I looked at my son, then at the cabin of documents now projected for all to see. My grandfather's legacy had just toppled an empire built on fraud. But even in that moment of triumph, I felt a chill, because people like Karen don't go quietly. And sure enough, as she stormed out of the gymnasium, I saw the fury in her eyes. She wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The night of the community meeting ended with Karen storming out of the gymnasium, her camera crew trailing behind her like obedient shadows. Most of the neighbors stayed behind, buzzing with disbelief, rallying around Earl, Marcus, and me. For the first time in months, people were questioning her authority instead of blindly following it. I should have slept well that night, but I didn't. I knew Karen's kind. She didn't lose gracefully. She retaliated. At sunrise, Ethan shook me awake. His face was pale, his voice urgent. "Dad, you need to see this." He dragged me to the porch, phone clutched in his hand. I followed his gaze down the road and froze. Heavy machinery roared in the distance. A construction crew in hard hats and reflective vests was hard at work, their bulldozers chewing into the earth, their drills whining. Within hours, they had erected a towering chain-link fence topped with razor wire that cut across our neighborhood like a scar. It didn't just run in front of my cabin, it snaked around Earl's driveway, through Mrs. Patterson's rose garden, and across the Hendersons' front yard. 6 families, trapped behind steel. "What the hell?" I whispered, my chest tightening. Ethan's camera was already rolling. "She started at 4 in the morning, he said grimly. "I caught everything. Dad, she's fencing in the entire block. It looks like a prison." The scene was surreal. By 7 a.m., an electronic gate system had been installed at the only entrance. A keypad blinked red, waiting for codes none of us had been given. The construction foreman barked orders from a clipboard, consulting blueprints that looked official but bore no county seals. Every so often, he gestured toward my cabin with a shake of his head, as if I were an obstacle to progress. Neighbors gathered at their fences, faces pale. Earl stood in his bathrobe, gripping the bars as though he couldn't believe they were real. Mrs. Patterson knelt in her garden, snapping photos of the razor wire cutting through her prize roses. Children cried, asking their parents why they couldn't walk to school. And then the media arrived. By 8 o'clock, 3 news vans were parked outside the barrier, their reporters broadcasting live HOA president builds prison fence around neighborhood homes. Cameras captured residents shouting through the fence, construction crews tightening bolts, and Karen herself strutting proudly along the perimeter. She wore a neon safety vest and held a megaphone, barking orders like a dictator. "This is for your protection," she declared, voice echoing. "These properties are non-compliant and unsafe. Until they meet community standards, they will remain quarantined." Quarantined. She actually said the word, as if we were diseased. Ethan panned his camera across the fence, his live stream counter skyrocketing past 20,000 viewers. Comments flew. "Is this even legal? This looks like kidnapping." Sue her into the ground. The internet was finally catching on. By mid-morning, Marcus arrived, weaving his way past the crowd of reporters. He held up a stack of papers, his face grim. Detective Kent was with him, followed by 2 county officials. When they reached the gate, Marcus called out, "Good news and bad news." "Jason." His voice carried over the clamor. "The good news is Karen just handed us the strongest evidence yet that she has no legal authority. The bad news is, it'll take hours for a judge to issue the order to tear this fence down. Karen smirked from her side of the barrier, her live stream still rolling. You see, even lawyers admit it. The law takes time, but leadership acts swiftly. She posed dramatically against the razor wire, playing the heroine for her followers, but she had made a fatal mistake. The county surveyor arrived shortly after noon to assess the damage caused by the fence's installation. As workers dug trenches for wiring, they had disturbed original property markers, rusty iron stakes buried decades ago by my grandfather. The surveyor brushed off the dirt, checked his measurements, and then announced loudly enough for the cameras. According to the original 1962 survey, this gate sits entirely on Miller family property. This fence is illegal. The crowd erupted. Reporters rushed to capture the declaration. Neighbors cheered, and Karen's mask cracked. For the first time, her smile vanished. Detective Kent began photographing the scene like it was a crime site. She spoke firmly, her voice clipped. Ms. Caldwell, this is no longer a civil matter. Constructing barriers that imprison residents without permits constitutes false imprisonment, among other charges. Combined with the fraud allegations, we are looking at multiple felonies. Karen's livestream caught every word. Her hand shook as she held the camera, her once steady tone unraveling. This is corruption. You're all in on it. These so-called residents are criminals trying to destroy our heritage, but her audience wasn't buying it anymore. Ethan showed me his phone. Comments flooded the screen. She's lost it. This is abuse of power. Someone call the FBI. By evening, the pressure broke. A court order arrived authorizing immediate dismantling of the fence. The same construction crew that had built Karen's prison was ordered to tear it down under county supervision. Their foreman approached me afterward, shame etched into his face. "Sir," he muttered, "the woman paid us in cash, gave us a return address that turned out to be a vacant lot. We can't even contact her." Karen was gone. As the last section of razor wire was hauled away, neighbors hugged, reporters shouted questions, and Ethan's live stream viewership soared past 50,000. We had survived her most desperate move, but the damage was undeniable. Trust in our community was shattered, and the scars of her tyranny would take time to heal. Yet even in defeat, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her never are. She'd retreat, regroup, and come back sharper, more dangerous. And when she did, we would need more than deeds and surveys. We'd need every scrap of evidence my grandfather had preserved. Because Karen's war wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that stretched far beyond our neighborhood. The morning after the fence came down, I thought maybe, just maybe, we could breathe again. Neighbors were still shaken, but there was a strange sense of relief in the air. Children ran across yards that had been barred just hours earlier, and Mrs. Patterson carefully replanted what was left of her roses. For the first time in weeks, the community felt united, yet beneath that fragile calm, everyone knew the storm wasn't over. Detective Kent confirmed it when she came by that afternoon. Her tone was sharper now, more official. "Mr. Miller," she said, flipping through the thick folder Earl had given her. "What we have here is no longer just a neighborhood dispute. This is evidence of widespread property fraud. The county is escalating this to the state level and possibly federal." I looked at Ethan, who was still cataloging documents with Marcus's help, and realized the fight we thought was local had just become national. The escalation came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, 2 black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood. Out stepped agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division, flanked by state investigators carrying briefcases heavy with warrants. They interviewed Earl first, sitting him at his kitchen table under the watchful lens of cameras that neighbors had set up to livestream every moment. For decades, he had carried his guilt in silence. Now he spoke freely, naming names, recalling dates, pointing out forged maps and describing the bribes Hayes had offered him back in 1985. The agents listened carefully, nodding, taking notes. When Earl slid the shoebox across the table, the one filled with tapes and maps, they treated it like a treasure chest. The weight of history was suddenly evidence in a federal case. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished. The address she had given to contractors was fake, her phone disconnected, her email scrubbed, but her digital footprint was harder to erase. Ethan, ever resourceful, dug into her live stream archives and cross-referenced usernames, IP addresses, and donation accounts. What he found was chilling. "Dad," he said one evening, spinning his laptop toward me, "she's not who she says she is. Her name isn't even Karen Caldwell. Look at this." On the screen was a string of aliases tied to property developments in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. Each followed the same pattern. She infiltrated an HOA, got herself elected, manufactured compliance violations, then used the fabricated authority to seize valuable land. "She's done this before," Marcus muttered, leaning closer, "and she'll keep doing it until someone stops her." The FBI agents confirmed Ethan's findings a day later. "The woman calling herself Caldwell is actually Teresa Collins," one of them explained, a former real estate developer who went underground after several lawsuits in the early 2000s. She's been reinventing herself in communities across the Southwest, exploiting HOAs as tools for property theft. "Your neighborhood is her third known operation." The words made me dizzy. We hadn't just been fighting one unhinged HOA president. We had been targeted by a career con artist running a decades-long scheme. As news spread, reporters swarmed the community. Headlines screamed HOA president under investigation for massive fraud. Cameras rolled as neighbors who had once cheered for Karen now lined up to give interviews, admitting they felt duped. But the biggest revelation came when Ethan cracked the encrypted folders on my grandfather's USB drive. Buried deep inside were scanned contracts, emails, and even recorded phone calls between Hayes and county officials. One call in particular made my blood run cold. Hayes's voice, calm and calculating, spoke of creating green spaces by redrawing maps. And in the background, another voice chimed in, "As long as the HOA looks legitimate, no one will question it." The voice belonged to a county commissioner, one still serving today. "This isn't just history," Marcus said grimly as we listened. "Hayes's network is still active." The evidence snowballed. FBI agents connected the dots across 12 communities in Colorado alone, each showing the same pattern of fraudulent land transfers. Operation Boundary Shift. They called it a conspiracy spanning decades, orchestrated through shell HOAs and complicit officials. Earl's testimony became the cornerstone of the case. Watching him walk into a federal building with his cane and that shoebox, shoulders straight for the first time in years, was something I'll never forget. "Your grandfather would be proud," he told me before stepping inside. "We're finally finishing what he started." Meanwhile, Ethan's live streams turned into a movement. What had started as a kid documenting his dad's fight against an HOA bully became a nationwide phenomenon. Tens of thousands tuned in daily, leaving comments like, "This happened to my aunt in Texas, and our HOA president tried the same thing." Stories poured in from across the country, exposing similar abuses of power. We had tapped into something bigger than ourselves, a collective fury at corruption hiding in plain sight. The final blow came when federal agents tracked Karen Teresa Collins to Denver International Airport. She was caught trying to board a flight under yet another alias, her suitcase stuffed with burner phones and forged documents. The arrest made national headlines. Footage of her in handcuffs replayed across every network. For our community, it was vindication, but it was also just the beginning, because the investigation didn't stop with her arrest. The FBI confirmed that her operation was part of a larger network stretching across 23 states, all connected back to Hayes's original fraud. Congress called hearings on HOA abuse. And suddenly my little cabin, the one my grandfather built in 1962, was a symbol in the fight for property rights nationwide. The land surveyors returned to restore the true boundaries. What they uncovered stunned everyone. Karen's house, the playground, and even the community center all sat on parcels of land that legally belonged to families who had been cheated decades ago. One by one, deeds were restored. Mrs. Patterson got her 3 acres back. The Hendersons regained access to the creek they'd been paying HOA fees to use. And my family. We didn't just get the cabin. We got back nearly 6 acres of land that had been stolen through fraud. Earl lived long enough to see it. At the community celebration, he stood tall before the crowd, his voice strong as he declared, "The truth always finds its way home." The ovation shook the gymnasium. Not for me, Not for Marcus, but for a man who had finally laid down his burden after 40 years. Every morning since, when I sip my coffee on the porch, I think of my grandfather, his stubborn pride, his foresight, his courage to document what others ignored. He knew the fight would outlast him, and thanks to him and to Earl, we had the weapons to win. Karen or Teresa, or whatever name she hides behind next, taught me something too. Bullies thrive in silence, in fear, in the spaces where people believe they are powerless. But the moment you shine a light on their lies, the whole illusion crumbles. Our battle was over, but the war for justice in communities like ours had just begun. When I look back on everything the hammer against my no trespassing sign, the razor wire fence, the courtroom-style meeting in the school gym, I realize this story was never just about my cabin. It was about power, fear, and the lengths people will go to when they think no one will stop them. Karen tried to turn neighbors into enemies and lies into law. But what defeated her wasn't anger or violence. It was truth, persistence, and community. My grandfather protected the evidence. Earl found the courage to speak. Marcus brought the law. And Ethan proved that even a 16-year-old with a camera can make a difference. Together, we exposed a fraud that had stolen not just land, but trust, for decades. The lesson is simple but powerful. Never underestimate the truth, and never let fear silence you. Because once you stand up, others will stand with you. If you've ever faced someone abusing their power, share your story in the comments. And if you believe truth deserves a louder voice than lies, hit subscribe because more battles like this are still being fought.